With ink, specifically iron gall ink, because of the iron in it, it has this almost like blood smell. And I think of it a lot as like how blood is an organ, how ink is an organ, how ink is like this thing that operates outside of us that helps us remember things.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we are so excited to talk about turning guns into ink and working with slime amoeba with artist Thomas Little. So what is the magic behind ink making? What does it mean to alchemically dissolve and transmute firearms, weapons of violence and destruction, into a liquidy solution used by magicians and artists to make marks on parchment and paper? How are slime amoeba and the intricate patterns they produce a living ink in and of themselves? Well, Thomas Little is the perfect person to ask. I first found out about Thomas's incredible work as an artist and an ink historian through the excellent artist, poet, and tarot deck creator Coleman Stevenson, who has collaborated with Thomas. Thomas is the proprietor of a Rural Pen Ink Works and is an artist, illustrator, and ink historian from North Carolina who merges alchemy, chemistry, esoteric art, and devotional practices into his work. We are very honored to discuss Thomas's background, how he turns guns into ink, his work with the Physarum genus of slime amoeba, and so much more. A huge thanks to Thomas for his generosity and time as I was putting this awesome podcast together, and also for sharing images of his incredible artwork if you're watching this on YouTube, or checking out his Instagram in the links below. Also, a huge thanks to each and every supporter of the podcast on patreon.com/glitchbottle for your support and your great questions for Thomas. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Thomas Little. Thomas Little, thank you so much for taking the time and stopping on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
There are so many things that I am thankful for with Coleman Stevenson and her spirit, her artwork. But among those many things, one of them was sharing with me about you, Thomas, and your incredible work. And can you share with us a little bit about your early background and growing up on the Black River in North Carolina? Can you tell us about growing up and the importance of rivers and your initial exposure with rivers, how that influenced you as an artist?
The river has played a very significant part of my life. We're going to talk about my father, I think, a little bit later, but he was, of many things, he's also a boat builder. The river was part of our livelihood. We'd build boats, we'd take them out on the river and travel up and down them. We do live on the one of the tributaries of the Black. It is a black river. It's one of the tannic acid rivers that are, pretty predominant here on the southeast. Lovely, sort of like root beer colored. That's where I learned how to swim, since I was a little kid, a little baby, playing around in the river. It's always been something that it's got a mystical quality to it, the rivers. I've sort of understood it more growing up, but the magic of rivers to me is they're passing by. There's something passing by you all the time. It's this conduit that's always like just a little bottle could be floating by. You'd never know it. That bottle could have its whole history and just sort of moves through the night, moves through the day, down the dark water. And like river narratives, I like them. Like, maybe not the best example, but I think of something like along the lines of like Apocalypse Now, where they're going up the river. It's like there's travels going up the river, or like Mark Twain, the Mississippi, like these stories that involve rivers. You go up and you're sort of seeing what's upriver and like also moving through that river as things are coming down. I don't know. It's just an interesting like little conduit that's always passing by. It's not a big river, the river we live next to. We could splash around in it up to our knees when it's slow. And it always sort of fascinated me. There's like another world. It's almost seemed, and maybe it's because of the colors and the sand that we have here. It was like almost like a desert. which makes no sense because it's water. But like, it seems like it's a desert world because it's all this sort of amber sand sparkling and shifting like dunes. It's got the most lovely hues varying from like gold to like a deep red to black, the deeper you get. Whenever I would imagine if it was like to live in a river, I always thought it was, it's like living in a hallway with a ceiling that changes constantly, going up and down and like opening up new doors and places. Like, it's sort of like this strange like way of imagining a world that you're living in where you're always in like this sort of like straight place. But every now and then a mysterious door opens up.
That is fascinating, Thomas. So it really sounds like, and I know that you shared this with Coleman Stevenson with an interview that both of you did a while back. But yeah, when I hear you describe the colors as well, I'm taking notes right now. This amber sand or root beer colored, kind of kinetic, constant flowing. I can see your inks, and I can see some of the pieces that you have that kind of draw from those very earthy tones. Would that be somewhat fair to say, or how do you continue to bring those colors into your work?
Well, it's funny. So what makes a black river is a high amount of tannin in the water. And that is a constituent of ink. In fact, there's a story that's published a lot. Well, it's still sort of circulating in like some backwaters of the internet, but it started out a long, long time ago. I want to say it was in the late 1800s about the river of ink in Algeria. And it was this sort of, I think it originated as like sort of a joke piece, but it was describing a very tannic river that ran through a swamp and a very iron-rich river running from another place and joining together, forming this river that flowed. It's sort of one of those stories. It's, also it's about the exotic mystery of Africa because the colonial mind doesn't want to actually explore it. It just wants to make up stories about it. And the way it evolved, it was like, first it was just this river of ink. And then it became like it ended in this black lake that was called like the Devil's Eye. And then like people like who lived next to the river, would dredge the ink up and they had like a little printing press and they like had hieroglyphics. And it was just like this spin-off of this little story, which in and of itself is almost possible. Like there could be, a river of ink with like a tannic rich swamp and an iron rich stream merging. It was always like almost close enough to be real. But yeah, those are just the colors. Those are the colors of ink. I mean, the thing about ink, these reactions, they're everywhere in the world. If you drive a nail into an oak tree, ink happens. When you split wet wood with an axe, you see ink turns the oak black. I mean, it's sort of like one of those things where wherever plants and iron touch, there's an ink happening.
To your very point, here you are growing up in this incredibly rich environment with this wonderful topography, earthy tones, constant connection to water. And in addition to that, your dad was a gunsmith. And this obviously, I know, plays a very key role in your own art. But you say, quote, "My introduction to chemistry was through making gunpowder with my dad, adding different salts to see different colors form in the flame, making our own fireworks," unquote. Can you share, Thomas, about the impact that had where you were learning from your dad, who was a gunsmith? What was that like?
Like I said, my dad, he did many things. He was a gunsmith early on in his life, and he also was a metallurgist. He made stained glass windows. He did a whole lot of things along with my mother, but he was always very interested in chemistry. And I think I definitely inherited the do-it-yourself spirit from both him and my mother. He was also, we got away with a lot of stuff when we were kids, especially considering what he would let us get away with. Like making our own explosives is probably, not up there with being the safest parent. But it was fascinating. I mean, what little kid doesn't like to light something and watch it? We never made like we did make a few explosions, but like mostly it was just pretty colors and like whoosh, like little soft ploofs of the gunpowder igniting. I mean, we sort of just had an open laboratory as, kids where we could do whatever we wanted, and sort of see what would happen. We used to fill up trash bags with acetylene and hold them over bonfires, which was a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And it would make this explosion deafen us and blind us temporarily. I don't know how we even survived some of the stuff we did. But, growing up in the rural South, you can do a lot of pretty sketchy stuff.
Wow, that is awesome. I remember, of course, as a kid, that common school experiment where it's like take baking soda and vinegar, but for you it was gunpowder and other chemicals, just trying to experiment.
Yeah, charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate. Those were the things. It was really making gunpowder is really interesting. I mean, it's funny. I still think gunpowder is kind of cool, and I do like fireworks. I mean, I think they're amazing little packets of alchemy. They're just interesting little things. I mean, they're magic unto themselves, like the little pyrotechnic things, and like seeing the wondrous things that like early Chinese alchemists could create. And like also involving like the whole color and metal connections, like, the copper blue greens and like the deeper potassium purples and strontium reds, like all these colors and like metals, like sort of creating their own display. It was really fascinating, really interesting, and totally magic. Like any good magician, knows the value of flash paper, the poof and the smoke. You got to have it.
And this kind of leads, Thomas, into the first listener question that we have for you from Daryl. Daryl is asking, "Hi, Thomas. I absolutely am enamored with your work and what you share online. It is stunning. How did you first become, Thomas, interested in transmuting guns into ink? I read that you lost a close friend to gun violence. I'm so sorry. Can you share anything about how you transmuted your own experience into this desire to turn firearms into ink? Thank you, Daryl."
Yeah. The genesis of all this started when I was doing my own illustrating work and wanting to learn more about the history of art supplies, kind of, I guess, like I also had to make my own. The chemistry involved in it uses iron, and we can get into this again later, dissolving in sulfuric acid to make one of the components, iron sulfate. I was like, well, that means anything made of iron could be dissolved. Of course, because of my father's gunsmithing days, we had lots of gun parts laying around. So it was easy. It was almost just, practical because we had this stuff. And I was like, wow. And then I made it. I made my first batch of ink. I was like, this is kind of like really powerful. And I've lost a very close friend of mine. Her name was Helen Hill. She was a animator, actually. I used to be an animator, actually, too, a stop motion animator. And she was my mentor. She was a really incredibly sweet person. She was really great. If I were to describe how great she was, no one would believe me, because she was just a genuinely sweet and wonderful person who was very thoughtful and very considerate of other people. And it pains me that I can't adequately describe how great she was, because you really would have to admit her. And, that's sort of like, is part of like what I think about when I'm doing my work, and the idea of how to give voice back to the folks whose voices have been taken away from guns and violence, especially here in the States.
What a powerful way to honor Helen and her memory. Does Helen flash in your mind every time you're creating something, or just how does that process work, especially with such a deeply personal experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, she does. I think about her a lot. She had this way of drawing that was very and she used to draw these chickens that had like little halos of like red and yellow, and they were like just little chicken feet. And I would draw them. That'd be sort of like one of the things that I would draw when I'm testing a batch of ink out. So it's sort of like a little test. And I would think of, of course I'm thinking of her, but I'm like, it's also a good little test for the ink, little chicken feet. I think of her in that way pretty regularly. It's just one of those things.
To that very point, Thomas, one of the questions listeners might be wondering, and I'm definitely wondering, is what the heck is an ink? You've mentioned that when you split wood with an axe, it's there, and talking about associations with rivers. And I'm thinking of some of the grimoires and lamp black, holding a spoon over a candle for 900 hours to get enough lamp black to make ink. Can you give us your definition of what is an ink from a physical standpoint, but also how do you see it as an artist?
Ink has always been sort of like, it's wonderful in the fact that it is sort of like a hard to define substance. I mean, I guess it is, I guess it isn't, but in my mind it is, just because I've conflated so many things with ink. And what is ink? Ink is a fluid or an extension of our body that we use to create external memory in the material world. So that's sort of like what I think about. With ink, specifically iron gall ink, because of the iron in it, it has this almost like blood smell. And I think of it a lot as like, like how blood is an organ, how ink is an organ, how ink is like this thing that operates outside of us that helps us remember things. There's a really great dialogue, one of the Plato dialogues between, I think it's Plato and Phaedrus. I'm not sure. It was a dialogue within a dialogue, but Plato was proposing like Thoth, I never say his name right, the Egyptian god of writing and magic, and having a discussion with Amun-Ra, I think, or a king, some higher, in the pantheon person, explaining all the wondrous inventions and gifts that he's given to humankind. And like the most potent one was like, I've given the gift of writing. It is like, I think even the translation, it's the elixir of memory. It's like this thing that like sort of is as Toth described it, something that would like give immortality to one's thoughts and words. And he was just going on lauding it. And then Amun-Ra, or whoever the higher up was saying, you're the best person to, make this assessment of your invention. Because what you're giving them is not wisdom, you're giving them the illusion of wisdom. You're giving them this thing that they can then like refer to without actually having a lived experience of it. And like, it actually is going to be, detrimental to humankind. And, that was what Plato was saying back then. I mean, of course, he was like sort of creating this sort of like, argument. But, you can definitely see how that it's really resonates today, especially when you think about, and here I'm going to say it because I'm a Wikipedia scholar myself, but like, I can go on Wikipedia and figure out everything. And all of a sudden I'm a genius and I'll tell you everything right and wrong about whatever topic I want to. But that's exactly sort of what Plato's point was, is like this idea of like, you're presenting this thing and like you're creating the illusion of wisdom, and people are going to walk around thinking that they're experts on something when they might not be. So, but here I am, maybe that guy.
Well, you seem to, and I know we'll chat about in the after show a little bit about William Blake, but one of the phrases that comes up with him is to marry the contraries. And I think that on the one side, absolutely, I can see that about, this elixir of memory and recording things, but also there's this aspect of, symbols as being this separator between the direct truth, and symbols are this kind of translated and coded meaning. So I can see the separation there. But then I see, Thomas, with your beautiful personal definition, with this very visceral, almost, ink being this physical expression in the external world, your definition seems to marry the contraries, to quote William Blake, and kind of eliminates that perhaps a false dichotomy that some might see between the internal and external. Is that kind of how you see it when you approach art, about kind of truly dissolving those boundaries?
Oh yeah, one of my favorite words is elide or elision, and it has this wonderful meaning in like both like in writing and in speaking, because like in elision, and when you're speaking is when like you sort of skip over something, or like when words sort of like I think one like a consonant gets lost or a vowel gets lost. But in writing, it's like the elision is like it's sort of the obliteration by blotting out something. So it's like it's a combination or an obliteration, but there's like this, it's just a sort of merging of things, like the blurring of lines. And also elision just has a beautiful mouthfeel. Yeah, I mean, I totally think about that. I think about that a lot. I feel like, we have to recognize that it exists. It has a physical presence. And ink is like a wonderful teacher in that, because it is just, you learn the history of ink, and you also learn the chemistry of ink and how it is in the world. And like, it also touches back on my ideas of what preservation of things means, like, archiving of things, like taking knowledge and like sort of fossilizing it in this way. And does it need to be fossilized? Should there be like an archive? The archive's an illusion. Like, everything's going to, turn to sand sooner or later. Like, what are we really holding on to? And is it good to like always have this sort of like fossilized like idea that's always there? Or should it be loosened up and like moved around? How can it be maintain some sort of dynamism? All those things I think about, that ink has really sort of led me down those paths.
I think there might be many listeners going, okay, this is amazing. Thomas literally transmutes and dissolves, firearms into ink. What are the broad strokes of this process? How does this work? What are the chemical reactions? What are the alchemical reactions?
So first, to talk about ink, as I was mentioning, we've talked about iron gall ink and these things. Iron gall ink, how it works is you have an iron salt. You have a source of tannins, in most cases galls that are derived from oak trees. I use a variety of sumac leaf, which has also got a high tannin content, but tannins are everywhere in plants. And a binder like gum. That's your sort of your essential ink recipe right there. Your iron source can be, anything. Most often it's iron sulfate in like most traditional recipes. And iron sulfate, of course, has this it was a staple in the alchemist's cupboard. It's known as copperous green vitriol, because there's also blue vitriol, which is copper sulfate, and white vitriol, which is zinc sulfate. There's a few different types of vitriols. I guess these days we hear vitriol and people think, acid or something caustic, something that eats through. Vitriolic is something that eats through. And really that doesn't have anything to do, etymologically speaking, with vitriol, except that it's referring to oil of vitriol, which is sulfuric acid that is generated from heating iron sulfate. And then that sulfuric acid is then distilled, and that is oil of vitriol. But through through time, the oil part left off, and we just hear vitriol and we think of acid. Vitriol itself, the word is related to in vitro, vitreous, vitrine, meaning glass, because the crystals are sort of like a sparkly glass color, really lovely. Vitriol. It's also known as, and this is a lovely phrase, the powder of sympathy. It was one of the things they used to describe it. And the quality described of the powder of sympathy was you take it and you dissolve it in water and recrystallize it. And you'd use it to effect a healing by, say, and for an example, someone was stabbed with a knife. That wound was festering, needed to be healed. You would take the powder of sympathy and you would rub the crystals onto the blade, and it would effect a healing sympathetically at a distance to that wound. It was even proposed as a possible, during the maritime navigation conundrum, where they were trying to figure out a way to get an accurate time at sea so you could then, navigate with the stars, because time and stars were, important in figuring out where you were going. One of the things that was proposed was stabbing a dog and then putting the dog on board of the ship. And then at noon, someone on the mainland would rub the knife with the powder of sympathy, and the dog would yelp because it would feel the healing happen. And so the person on the boat would be like, oh, it's noon. But of course, that I don't think ever happened. And I really hope they didn't try it out. But that's sort of one little interesting thread about iron sulfate. That homeopathic quality, that sympathetic magic, that definitely is something that informs my ink making as well. So yes, iron sulfate, and then you mix it with tannic acid and gum, and then you have your ink. I make my iron sulfate with firearms, handguns. Most recently, and what's been very popular is an assault rifle. I've been dissolving, that was given to me. Bayonets, I have some Russian bayonets in the pot. You put the gun, in battery acid. Well, first you heat it up. You heat it up to take out the temper and to get rid of any of the things that are, combustible and off of it. So you heat it up and you have sort of this burnt gun. You insert it into a jar with battery acid that you can get, at an auto parts store. And that's a dilute sulfuric acid. It's like half and half. It's not the kind of stuff that's going to eat your hand off if you dip it into it. I always tell people, don't get too scared. It will eat holes in your clothes, because I have plenty of t-shirts that have many holes in them from this. And that takes about a week, and you start getting these lovely blue-green crystals of blue vitriol. And you take that and you mix it up and you make your iron gall ink. In my case, iron sumac.
Oh, yes, the iron sumac. Exactly. And I love, by the way, Thomas, that is such a beautiful etymology with vitriol and vitriolic and glass. I can see that, especially when you're dissolving those crystals after a few days just popping up. I mean, it's so gorgeous. Just love that.
Yeah, I love it too. It's essentially, it's a salt, iron sulfate's a salt. So it sort of disintegrates from, it's beautiful, toothpaste green crystals to sort of like a white powdery substance. But, that's fine. That's all part of watching that's the beauty of the process. No one really gets to see is these beautiful green emerald like things happening, and then it just turns into like dust. But if I do workshops, I like to bring a little like, crystallized section so people sort of get an idea of like what it is. I mean, it's cool. It's like, it's crystals and herbs.
To that point, Thomas, you also say that, quote, sometimes, though, when I'm making a blot or doodling, I forget that I'm using material that used to be a Smith & Wesson, and I kind of like that. The weapon that steals voices has its own identity erased, anonymized, a kind of damnatio memoriae of artifacts. Unquote. I love this quote. You were sharing this with Coleman Stevenson in your interview, but can you share a little bit more about what it means to you when you transmute the identity of a gun into this new identity of ink?
Right. Yeah. It's one of those things where if I were to really like obliterate or elide the identity of the gun, I probably shouldn't say, anything about what it's made out of. And then I would just make the ink. And then that would be like the purest way to do it. But no one, since I am running a business, no one's really going to be interested in just ink. So I have to that's my gimmick is like, oh, it's made out of guns. I mean, in the ideal world, in my fantasy realm, I'm selling ink, on the street out of my little cart, and, everyone needs ink in that world too. It's not something free you can get at a bank, or like, pick up a ballpoint pen somewhere. Ink being such an amorphous thing, shapeless thing, like the idea of like whatever solid, the solidity of iron, like, these things that are hard and like, in often cases, brutal things, like sort of becoming like amorphous shadow things, creatures. They then put in a little bottle. It feels very wizardy for one thing. I mean, you're sort of just taking like the essential salts of like this weapon and you're sort of changing into something that is then like almost more ghost-like. Because ink can be so many things. It can be so mysterious, even slightly sinister. I mean, that's one of the things I like to play with is the idea of like ink, of course, is not an innocent thing. There's papal bulls, legal writs, territories drawn up. There's like, there's plenty of ways to weaponize ink. In fact, it's probably more weaponized than any other substance. But I like to play with that idea of like sort of spectral sinisterism going on about it. It's just sort of this like odd little creature that lives like a little goblin inside your bottle. It's the obliteration of form, the reprimordializing of an object that I think about when I dissolve my guns.
As an artist, you were talking with Cole about how it's also a form of expiation in a way. Can you share more about that in terms of, as you, the artist, as someone who individually is having an alchemical, if you will, experience and transmuting personally? Can you share more about how is that for you, in addition to the physical dissolving and those changes, how is that an expiation of sorts?
To touch more on the expiation thing, you sort of have to understand about iron, what iron is and what iron exists in like the cosmological, like mythological realms. If you really want to know a lot about the mysticism of iron, I highly recommend Heidi Gustafsson's Book of Earth. She's a really great friend. We love to talk about iron together. She has this an ochre archive that she's developed that is really impressive, and she touches on a lot of really interesting cultural uses of ochre, like where it is and like ritual practice and things. But yes, iron, of course, classically Hellenistically, iron, it's martial, it's Mars, it's male energy, it's, aggression, it's all those things that, don't have necessarily the positive connotations. In stellar fusion, like iron is like the first element that no longer fuses and releases energy. It's where it takes energy to fuse and it does to release. Along the way, as the sun is like, generating energy, that's like the middle age. That's like the point where the sun or the star like, starts dying. So iron is like this death of stars. And like that is like, sort of like this existentially terrifying quality of it. The ender of light. It's terrifying, totally terrifying. But if stars never died, then there would never be planets and there would never be, the massing of like, little balls of dirt like we are. And furthermore, another way that iron almost acts like, in this way of like a nurturing substance, is like the core of the earth, is generating a dynamo, like a magnetic field around the planet that allows like oceans and atmospheres to form. So it's creating this nurturing ball around the planet. So it's like this creatrix destructor god. Like I call it the death mother, iron, the death mother. It's something that destroys and then creates like a Luciferian fall from nuclear paradise, like, and then becomes matter and like mattering into like this, into the real world, and then creating its own like little life form. Anyway, when you think about it like that, you're taking cold iron, you're taking steel, you're taking like a weapon, and you're liberating itself from the destructive parts, and you're allowing it to become a creative thing. And like, I think that might be sort of like the expiation that we're talking about, is like, it sort of becomes something that can be many things. Ink can be many things. Gun can do one thing. Knives can do one thing. Like, these weapons are really designed to do one thing, but ink can do so much more. It can do all these beautiful, wonderful things, as well as terrible things. But at least there's like, equaling the playing ground a little bit.
I was just recently rereading John Milton's Paradise Lost, and I'm thinking of, that fall of Milton's Satan and being surrounded by flaming sulfur and all of these things. And now I will forever be thinking about this connection that you just shared about ink and iron and kind of liberating it. That's so wonderful. I
think in Paradise Lost, didn't Satan invent gunpowder in that?
Yes. Actually, you are so good and have much better memory than I do. But yes, he mentions that he is showing the infernal legions that this earth gives us everything we need. We can make anything we want. And there's this kind of process of making gunpowder. And even Cormac McCarthy in the novel Blood Meridian talks about this, where one of the characters imitates Milton's Satan about showing people on the rim of this extinct volcano how to combine different things to make gunpowder. I really enjoy hearing about the way that you think about that as an artist, as an alchemist, as a practitioner. You also talk about this in your chat with Coleman, Stevenson, about when it comes to this idea of alchemy and ascending the ladder versus maybe more of like moving in a wheel. And to that point, we have a listener question for you, Thomas, from Jabril. And Jabril is asking and saying, wow, this is my first time seeing a Rural Pen's artwork and posts. Incredible. I read the interview Coleman did with Thomas, and I have a question. I always thought the great work of alchemy was about moving upwards in a spiritual process. However, Thomas shares that his alchemy is more like, quote, walking in a wheel, unquote, than climbing a ladder. I'm very interested in hearing more about what Thomas means, unquote.
Sure, yeah. Well, I always refer to myself as a student of alchemy, never an alchemist, because I don't want to assume a knowledge base that is not mine. I approach it more as like a way of viewing the world. And there's a lot of people who are like, oh, no, these are the hard rules of alchemy. That's not how I, ascribe to the idea. Alchemy is like this fusion of art and magic and science, and like how those three things can like be used to make the world like, a better place. The work within those three things. The idea of ascension implies that there's some sort of hierarchy, right? Like you're going to go somewhere better, or like there's something that you're going up towards, like this sort of like the great chain of being in a way, which is, it's problematic, because that means that like wherever you're leaving was not worth staying, or like, the thing beneath you is like, base, and like, we shouldn't just leave it there. We shouldn't just like abandon the base things in the world. That's what I think of the wheel. Like, it's something that we go back, we move through. The great work is a verb. It's not, a noun. The work is something you're always doing. You're doing the work. You're doing the work. You're doing the work. Like, you're not climbing that ladder, because eventually, if you were doing the work, eventually you're going to get to the top of the ladder or whatever, like, or you're aiming for it. But if you're working within the wheel, you're always doing the same thing. It's like chopping wood, carry water. It's like, that's what you do, and you keep doing it. And yeah, that's sort of what I think of as the great work, and like how I perceive it.
Whether, Thomas, it's making ink, whether it's inkblots, whether it's any aspect of your work, I think there might be some listeners wondering if you have any ritualistic components that you adhere to. And I know you mentioned talking with Coleman that, for instance, when you're working, you prefer white noise or perhaps a rattle or silence?
When I make my ink, the ink it's a process, so it takes a while. I have to take the gun. The rituals are pretty practical. I have to have a fire because I have to burn the gun to make it, receptive to the acid. And I have to have a vessel to fill with acid to dissolve it. I mean, I put it in an old Honda. I'm looking at it right now. It's an old Honda Civic that doesn't run anymore, so it heats up. I always joke like that's like the alchemical apparatus that you never see in the manuscripts is an old Honda Civic. I wish I could have a really solid ritualistic like schedule that I could adhere to. Like, oh, this is the time to do this. Like my friend was like, oh yeah, do it on Tuesday, do it in the hour of Mars. And I'm like, I just can't keep track of time like that. I really have a hard time being able to nail it when it comes to like elections, something that I have a hard time with. But that doesn't mean to say that I don't have like my own like ritualistic practices. I definitely have them when I'm making certain things. I like to use my ink. I like to make ink blots, and it's sort of a bit of a ritual thing I do. I like to clear my mind. I use the rattle to clear my mind, to sort of like, not have any sort of intention in whatever I'm like putting down onto the paper. And sometimes when I'm using the ink blot as a meditation target, I do like, I'll listen to white noise, or like not quiet, but maybe obfuscate the constant bantering going on in my head, so I can sort of just appreciate the asemic nature of the ink blot. I like to work in silence, and it sort of helps me. I like to learn with my hands. I use my hands, and my hands are sort of like the stimulating thing in my mind. If there's sound going on, then my hands have to sort of be still for some reason. I don't know if that makes sense. It might just be the way I'm wired. I'm not sure. But not that I don't like, to turn up the jams every now and then and dance, I'm not a square. So don't walk away with that impression.
You are totally immersed in what your hands, as you say, as those instruments are exploring. And so if there's other input coming in, it might not distract, but it just might be a thing where then, your single focused attention will then be directed in another area as opposed to what you're working on. I don't even know if that makes any sense, but
it totally does. It's so easy for me. I'm very easily distracted. But that also speaks a lot to like, why I like ink so much. I can exhaust something really quickly. If I get like interested in like a topic, I'll exhaust it. I'll like figure everything out. It's like I've chewed all the flavor out of the gum and I'm like, I'm over it. But ink is like one of those things that like offers all these pathways that you can always just wander down. Ink as legal instrument, ink as ink blot, ink as printing ink. It's just all the things. It's all of these. It's this fluid it just goes everywhere, crawls around a little bit.
How do you, Thomas, to that point, use the ink that you make? For example, can you tell us what the heck is an ink blot as an artist? How do you apprehend that? And then what kind of paper or material do you impress the ink upon? What would you like listeners to know?
I could talk about ink blots a lot. When I started making ink, I was just so enjoying the materialness of it. I just stick my fingers in it and like, rub it all over my hands and just smear it everywhere. And like, I don't know, I was just really enjoying it like a 6-year-old with like finger paint. I was like into it. And like one of the ways I like really enjoyed like sort of seeing it expressed is an ink blot, because it's just, there's easy, you fold a piece of paper, you make an ink blot, and like you have like a little picture. And it was satisfying. And I also got, it wasn't all just little kid fun stuff. I was also could observe the ink phenomena. I like see sedimentation and like gloss and stuff like that. So I was like reading up on it. Of course, I looked at, Rorschach. But then going further back, like realizing that there was like sort of what the history of ink blots was. It must be ancient history. It's just such a simple thing, like folding a piece of paper with ink on it. But I traced it far back to Justinius Kerner, and he was a German mystic physician. He wrote this account on the Seeress Provorst. She was a sort of like she'd have visions. It's a whole fascinating story too. She had like these sort of like ideas of the inner world and the inner language. And like one character of the inner language could encompass an entire man's life. And she like had these visions, and she would talk to him about him, like, what she would see. And it was a really interesting thing. And he like recorded her life. But that's sort of a side story. He was also wrote this book called Klexographen, and it was a book of poetry that was sort of inspired by ink blots. Ink would land on the page and he would blot it over, and he would see something and he would write a little poem about it. And he called these images from Hades, is what he would describe them. They were like shadows that were like from the underworld. He would see them and like they would sort of be delivering these messages, like, and that he would interpret those messages and through like illuminating the ink blot or writing a poem about it. And I just thought that was like so cool. I mean, like, it was like, why isn't there's got to be like, there should be more of like a divinatory field in ink blots, because like it just seems like there's got to be one. And maybe there is one. It's just sort of become what we think of now, like with the Rorschach test and things. And I think Rorschach, he was really hitting on something really interesting. And it's a shame he died so young, because I'd like to have seen what else he could have done. This idea, the whole Rorschach test being presented as like, oh, this is a diagnostic to like see into your mind and like totally understand you. Like, that's very like witchy. I mean, that's totally witchy, but like, it's like, it was calibrated into science. Like, those ink blots, of course, were actually ink blots. Rorschach painted all those individually. Like, they were not incidental things. He painted them like they were paintings. He appreciated that level of like, it can't be too distinctively reminiscent of one thing. It has to be just suggestive to be something, but still ambiguous to be something else. Like, and that fine line, understanding that fine line is fascinating. Like, how do you calibrate like that thing, that liminal space in your mind where it's like, is it something, or is it like, oh, or is it this thing? Or like, rather than it be like, oh, that's a bunny rabbit, that's a butterfly, or like, that's just like some random smear of ink, I don't know what it is. So understanding that space, I think is like so interesting to me, both like, of course, as an artist, because that's what that's sort of what we do, but like with the scientific point of that, it's like, this is that level of like, maximum ambiguity / suggestiveness. And the Rorschach test was like, so popular, like, it was used everywhere, constantly, all of the time. So like, there's like a huge stockpile of data about the Rorschach test. There was a paper about figuring out what is the quality of the ink blot that suggests the most stuff. Like, how can we mathematically determine this thing that like suggests the most images? And it was using fractal analysis of the ink blot and figuring out the fractal dimension of it, its fractalness, its fractality. And there was like one number, like it was 1.1 something, like maybe 1.11. But it was the fractal dimension that was like the most suggestive, that had the optimal spatial frequency for image perception. So there was a way to like calibrate this like thing to like be like this like super ink blot. Like, I'm going to find this ink blot. I'm going to make this ink blot, and I'm going to run it through like the box counting algorithm, and I'm going to figure out if it's got that magical number, and like, creating the ultimate ink blot. Like, what is that? Like, what would that look like? Ink blots, they are in a way this interesting, almost like a necromancy in a way, because it's what ink blots do. Like, so when we look at an ink blot, it's our facial form part of our brain that's like seeing a face or seeing something. Like, we are experiencing pareidolia, the phenomena of seeing, a pattern where there's not really that pattern there. But when we do that, we're interacting with part of our brain that's been developed over millennia to recognize, oh, that's a friendly face. Oh, that's like, a lion, or like, that's like, this animal or whatever, like this part of the brain that's been sort of like calibrated to like see these things. So when we look at an ink blot, we're sort of triggering that part of our brain that's so old, that's created to see these like patterns and faces. And like, in that way, it's almost like, you are engaging with this ancient part of your mind that was like shaped by like all these things from millennia back, millions of years back even. Isn't that sort of like seeing an ancestor or seeing something ancient? Like, it seems to me like that's close. As close as, I can get.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions about either ink blots, turning guns into ink that you come across that some people might have? Is there anything that you'd like them to know instead, and to kind of counter maybe a misconception or something that they might not be aware of when you share your work with people?
I like to sort of illuminate the idea of what the ink that I make is, because the ink that I make, iron gall ink, or that variation, that type of ink, was in use for like, almost 1,000 years, maybe longer. Like it's a very old ink and only became, not used towards the early 20th century. So like it's just recently sort of fallen out of favor. So people today, of course, are used to, well, ink is black and it's always going to be black and it's permanent and it'll always, be these things. It's like it's sort of lost that it's not what people expect ink is supposed to be necessarily. So it's sort of a little bit about educating people about like what ink was and, the beauty of it. Ink chemistry, the whole way ink works. Like, so it's an iron gall. We'll call it an ink molecule. The ink molecule is an gallocannate of iron molecule, floats in liquid, unoxidized, it's clear and soluble. With the exposure to atmospheric oxygen, that it becomes dark and insoluble. So when you draw this line on the page, that ink then becomes dark and solid and embeds itself into the fibers of the paper. And that's what makes it an indelible ink. And that is what makes it a superior information technology back in the day when you're carrying documents across the ocean or whatever, or in a rainstorm. And like that is, technically cool. When you think about it, ink as an organism, as an organ, like it breathes on paper and it dies and like expires and leaves this like memory there on it, taking this animus spirit and like sort of like sacrificing it for like your thoughts. It's this really beautiful magic. And like one of the things in my readings, and this goes back to like iron, I can never say anthroposophist. Can you say that for me?
I am going to be much worse at it than you. Anthropos. Oh my goodness. Now I can't do it.
Yeah. Okay. Anthroposophy, and that. The school that Rudolf Steiner, that whole thought school. I don't necessarily subscribe to it. Like it's flawed. All the law system's really flawed. I feel like that one's specifically like way too focused on like, Western things and like, what about the Southern Hemisphere and like those. Anyway, that said, one of his disciples, students, another Rudolf Hauschka, he wrote this book called The Nature of Substance. And it was this book that sort of assigned like these almost supernatural qualities to different elements. And that's one thing I like about anthroposophy is that like it created this sort of like interface that was understandable and like sort of brought a mysticism into like, the more modern understanding of like science, which I think is cool and what I would like to do. But again, it's a flawed system. Nothing's perfect. And of course, you're never really going to understand all these mysteries anyway. But his chapter on iron was really interesting to me because it was like one of the longer chapters than the other metals. He says that the quality of iron brings the cosmic ethereal into the sphere of gravity. So it sort of brings like the things that are like intangible into like the solid world. And as a progression of that, it also not only will create, a physical form for the cosmic ethereal, it also can like on the other end mummify, fossilize, and like stop it. So iron has that interesting quality in that it does that. But you can also see these parallels in like nuclear fusion. Iron, by becoming like the death point in stars, like becoming like this thing that starts mattering, creating matter outside of the cosmic ethereal. Like, when you want to talk about like plasma, like that's pretty cosmic ethereal stuff. It is bringing the cosmic ethereal into the sphere of gravity. Like, then there's also like the metaphor, the image of what are you doing when you're writing? Like you're bringing an idea down and giving it the weight of a word and like putting it on paper. And then also that same image of like iron falling out of solution and crystallizing into something dark and hard and like solid and like embedding itself into paper. Like all those lines are there and like this description of like iron and like how it works. And like, I just feel like all those things sort of like compound in this like yummy little sandwich of like, yes, that makes sense.
What could be a better explanation of an esoteric procedure than by bringing those intangible elements literally into this Malkuthian sphere, into this plane?
It's funny you mentioned the Malkuthian sphere too. Like, if you look at the colors of Malkuthian sphere, right? What are they? They're citrine. They're like olivine, citrine, and there was like a sort of a light brownish one. I can't remember what actually name is. And there's black, right? What's really cool is if you take the constituents of ink, your iron sulfate sort of turns into this olivine color. Your sumac is sort of like this other color, the russet. It was russet. the russet color. And then the gum is like also like this other, like, it's like these other colors, and together they make the black. And I always like wondered, like, why were those colors the ones that were like the spear of Malkuth? And like, how isn't it odd that all those colors form to make ink? Another scholar will work on that one, but
in addition to all of this, you also work with slime molds, and specifically, and I'm going to horribly mispronounce this, so please correct me, Thomas, the Physarum polycephalum aspect of slime molds, a specific genus and species of slime molds. I think for listeners who might be hearing this for the first time, and of course we will be linking to and check out the YouTube video where you can see some of Thomas's gorgeous work with this. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the Physarum polycephalum, which I'm mispronouncing, and what are slime molds, and how did you first become exposed to working with them?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think your pronunciation is beautiful. So slime mold, what is slime mold? Slime mold is a terrible name for it because it's not really a mold. It is slime, that's accurate, but it's not a mold. It's a giant amoeba or collection of amoebas operating within one cell. It's acellular. So it has lots of nuclei floating around the same cell wall. So when you see what's called a plasmodium of slime mold, it's actually one cell. And the plasmodium is one stage of its life cycle. And that's the stage that's just offers the most compelling things and fascinating phenomena. So it's a yellow slime. It's found in like the woods, deciduous woodlands, moist, rotting logs, one of the places it likes to hang out. And it appears in its plasmodial stage as sort of like a yellow slime or like a network of veins that's sort of covering a surface. It's very distinctive. It's very bright yellow, very bright yellow. That's one of the things that you can always recognize it. So there is a similar one that's called Sphulgioseptica, which is also known as dog vomit slime mold, which does not exhibit the same interesting behaviors, but also looks yellow until it starts looking like dog vomit. That's its fruiting body. Is like, I'm going to go from this beautiful yellow thing to dog vomit. It is a organism that evolved a billion years ago. It was one of the organisms that began breaking down minerals into soil. It's literally older than dirt because it was one of the things that was creating dirt on Earth. It's an organism that evolved before animals, fungus, plants, any of those were even distinct from each other. And so it has the qualities of all these things while still remaining super archaic because it doesn't have any organized, organs. Like there's no brain, there's no system involved. It's just like a bunch of like collective behaving nuclei. It has like 780 sexes, which is something that I throw out as a factoid, but in actuality, I have no idea how it works. But, when you're on that scale, like, sex is more about exchanging genetic information and less about, organs that fit into different organs. So it's pretty fascinating. But what's really so interesting about it is it creates networks to connect like, different food sources to like another food source. And it creates like the more efficient way of like transferring nutrients. It's already wonderfully good at creating like a system of like moving things. So one of the things that they use in labs, and it's like one of those model organisms that you find in a laboratory, along with like little white mice, is like using it to like sort of make, hypothetical maps or like solve mazes. It's particularly good at solving mazes because it's a blob, it's an amoeba, so it can go down all the hallways at once and then figure out which one's the shortest way. So, and then it creates that path. So it's like this, it solves a maze in that very alien, strange way that, we can't fathom because we're bilaterally symmetrical, two eyes on the head creatures. Whereas it's like, I'm everything. I'm an amoeba. I can move everywhere at once. It's really cool. And it also behaves in like different ways with different materials. It's repulsed by some things, it's attracted by some things, and what's known as like positive negative chemotactic behavior that it exhibits. And it moves like by pulsing in a peristaltic wave, like as it moves around on things. So like, and it moves pretty quickly. Mine, I've clocked at like a centimeter an hour. So it definitely moves pretty fast for a single cell organism, and much faster than your average houseplant. It's easy to get out of hand. It has crawled out of the Tupperware containers many times. It's made some unfortunate stains, and it doubles in size every day. That's the other thing about it. It'll eat. When I feed it, it just doubles. And once it starts going, it just grows and grows and grows. I feed it oatmeal. It loves oatmeal. It's one of its favorite foods.
Can you share a little bit more about, it's getting its energy source from the oatmeal that you put in the center of your piece, for example. But then what I found so fascinating is you use valerian root. So the first question would be like, what is valerian root? But when you use it, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you make outlines or traces on paper, for example, of valerian root, usually instead of the slime amoeba, and we're going to get rid of that word mold, slime amoeba being attracted to it, you found that with your specific kind of slime amoeba, it actually is repulsed or avoids valerian root. So can you talk about how you power this specific amoeba with oatmeal, but then how valerian root acts as a guiding boundary as it expands? I'm doing a horrible job of explaining this. Please correct me and take it away from there.
I'll give you how we met, how we and the slime met. It was a rainy November night, actually, or September. I was watching TV. I wish this was like something like more amazing, like I had it in a dream or whatever, but I was watching PBS, and it was a Nova episode about slime mold. And I was like, I know that stuff. I saw that walking in the woods earlier. And because it rained, I was still active. And I went out, and there it was on this rotting stump that I'd been walking over since I was, 6 years old or younger. And I was like, that's neat. And of course, I learned through the episode that it likes oatmeal. And I'm like, well, I'll make a little oatmeal, take a little bit and put on it. And I took maybe, I don't know, it was about the size of a cornflake amount of slime, and I put it on some oatmeal. And it did fine, and it grew, and we've been happy ever since. So yeah, it would eat, and it just kept going. So I, of course, since I'm a pigment person, I'm like, I want to know, how can I make this, use this in art? I'd love to know more about this thing. Can it carry pigments? Can it create these beautiful vascular networks, and somehow they'd be preserved without me actually having to kill the slime mold? Reading up on it, I find out that it likes one of the best pigments that it actually uses or carries is iron oxide pigments, which I'm like, well, what do you know? I make iron oxide pigments. So I mixed up some oatmeal with some red iron oxide. It was a beautiful bloody gruel. And I made a little blob of it. It looked like a little heart, actually. And I put it down, and I put the slime mold on it. And it crawled all over it, and it started eating the oatmeal, and it carried the iron through its little network. And it sort of compiled the iron as it went through, and sort of left it in this, this sort of map-like formation. I was like, wow, so that's cool. It carried it. So it ate the oatmeal. And in fact, it might even use some of the iron as a micronutrient. So it's not necessarily I'm forcing it to eat the iron. It helps the slime mold. Maybe. We'll see. That's what I've heard. So wow, that's neat. And I'm like, well, I wonder how I can manipulate it further. In reading about it, from the TV show, I was understanding valerian root is usually an attractant to slime mold, to the point where slime mold will even hang out with it and die. It won't get food. It'll just hang out with the valerian root and ignore food, and then it'll just perish. And I was like, well, I wonder if I could use it as a lure, if I could attract the slime mold to this valerian root. And valerian root is one of those things you can find at an herb store. It's used for relaxing and helping people sleep. So I went out and I got a little valerian root, and I was putting it on the paper, seeing if it would move. I was like, it's not attracting to it. What's going on? So I finally put it right next to the slime mold, and I watched it, and it veered away from it, and it was repulsed by the valerian root. And I'm like, what's going on? I thought you were supposed to like this stuff. And I kept doing it and kept doing it. And I was like, okay, you obviously do not like valerian root. You're some anomalous behavior creature. I don't know what's going on. I was like, anyway, we'll see. I'll play around with that. I mixed up a batch of ink with black iron oxide and valerian root, and I'd make ink blots because I love making ink blots. And I made a little blob of the red iron oxide oatmeal and put it in the middle of the ink blot, and the slime mold would fill up the interior of the ink blot and sort of reach all the way to the edges of the blot and then stop because of the valerian root, and then retract and create the network that would exit the inkblot, exit outside of the inkblot. And like when I did that, I was like, this is real. Something really cool is going on here. I don't know what's going on quite. But I started seeing these evocative images were coming out. And then there was like this sort of like these suggestions of anatomical drawings, or like, some sort of like little flayed homunculi that's been laid open. And like, there's like all this sort of interesting stuff. And like also thinking about like how an inkblot, interpreting inkblot, visually as a human, and like how interpreting inkblot, on like the tiny level as a slime mold, and like, those parallels, and like just like all this, fascinating stuff. But, the interesting thing about valerian root too is valerian root, the compound in valerian root that causes us to be sleepy, is what causes cats to be frisky, and also what causes slime mold to behave the way it does towards it. And those compounds are found in other herbs, including catnip and passion flower. So those compounds are in all of these different things. And all three of those plants elicit the similar reactions with cats and people and slime mold. And I was like, wow, there's like this fascinating, like chemical, like language that we're all sharing here that like, we all react differently with. And I thought, like, wow, that was cool too. Like, there's like some link between slime mold cats and like slime mold. And I'm like, there's something witchy going on here. It was neat. And then I was like, I got to keep making these. So I had like, Tupperware container and Tupperware container and Tupperware container full of oatmeal, to the point where I was really worried that my landlord would find me in my studio with like all these Tupperware containers full of like slimy oatmeal. And I had to explain what was going on. Luckily, that never happened. But I just make these stacks of like slime mold and inkblot creations using the iron oxide pigments that I was making.
You were talking earlier about the Rorschach test and kind of divination by inkblot. Can you tell us a little bit about just your thoughts on divination by slime amoeba? Anything from an artistic perspective or about that kind of divinatory aspect too?
The thing about, I don't know, what I think of sometimes like with the divinatory practices is like, it's like getting the answer and then like spending a lot of time and interpreting it. One of the things that I was doing with the ink blots and the slime mold, and I would think about when I was making it, it's like, how do I communicate with something that's like this ancient, that's like, so unhuman, such like an essential like spirit almost, this gnomic entity that like sort of just exists. Like slime mold is biologically immortal. It's not programmed to die. It just keeps growing, and it'll change shapes as it moves to accommodate whatever's going on. Like if it's going to, in a starvation condition, it makes spores, and the spores then scatter and then stay, dormant until they're reactivated. Or like if it's exposed to water, they become individual flagellated amoeba and they swim away. It can be dried into sclerosium that stays dormant for months, and then when you add a little food and water, it comes back to life. It's evolved these strategies, and like I don't like the teleological constraints that we have to, use to explain things, but that's how we have to do it. But it's evolved these strategies to like survive all these different things. So like, who's to say how old the yellow slime mold even is that I'm dealing with? Like, it could be like, who knows how old? It's like ancient. It could be like the first slime mold. Who knows? But yeah, that thing has been around. It's like survived mass extinctions, like in so many ways. And like, it's like just this humble little thing that crawls around. Like, how do we even like start to develop a dialogue? That was sort of like when I came up with an idea. Like an inkblot's a bilaterally symmetrical thing. It's like, an animal, essentially. Most animals, 99% of animals are bilaterally symmetrical. This is my animal question to you, amorphous slime deity. And the slime, of course, like created its response. It filled the inkblot and created like this vascular structure. And like, it made me think a lot about like also how in our bodily formation, like how veins form around things that don't need to have veins in them. Like, these vascular structures that like avoid parts. I felt like I was watching something happen, like that was like sort of like this element of creation that was almost like Frankensteinian, it's like something really interesting. And going back to ink, like, the idea of, okay, ink is a fluid, an extension of our body that we use to create external memory in the material world. That's what slime mold is. Slime mold, what makes it behave the way it does, what makes it organize itself into like the network that makes it go through the maze, is it leaves a deposit in its trails of like little chemical markers saying like, okay, you've been here, There wasn't anything here. Don't come back. So it leaves this external memory of its movement. So that's how it creates these like connections between food sources, for example. So it is an ink. It's using external memory to understand its world. It's just like how we write books about things or draw maps of unknown countries. It's how we, as like, if we can imagine us as being a whole bunch of amoebas, it's like a little microcosm of souls, which we can apply to like our human experience. So it was like two different inks, my inkblot and its external memory laid out. It's like autobiography of navigating this landscape of a ape who created something that sort of reminded him of like his reptile ancestors, I guess.
You say that when it comes to this interface, the inkblot is the question and the slime gives its answer. Does that kind of feed into what you were just sharing about that kind of divinatory direct apprehension of this living being going on?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to the limitations in which, language works, being question and answer, even that feels like almost too, crude. It's the response it's the dialogue of form. For me, this idea of what the dialogue of form is, how we see how things have moved through time and how it shapes the physicality of things, especially living things. For example, the black locust tree has grown, really large, scary thorns on it to keep mammoths from, rubbing up against them or whatever. And now mammoths are gone. So what do we have if we didn't have, fossils or anything else like that? The mark of the mammoth is these thorns that are sticking out of the locust tree. Like trying to understand like what a mammoth is by understanding just thorns on a locust tree. Understanding an object through the vacancy of the object. And like that's sort of like one of the things I was like, imagining in a larger scale and in like the smaller scale. Like when you see the slime mold filling out the inkblot and moving out, you see what happened. You see what its process was. But all you see at the end result is like this like thin line of iron oxide that's been moved through. You don't see what happened. So you're sort of just, trying to understand the process just through interpreting that one network of red ink. Like that's sort of, part of how I think about it too. The way divination would work for me is just sort of like understanding. That's how difficult it is to like sort of attain something, some greater wisdom. It's like you're actually having to like fill in the blanks, and the blanks are huge, like gigantic, and they might not make any sense at all. How do I know a woolly mammoth is woolly or even has tusks just by judging from a thorn on the side of a tree? Like that sort of leaps of imagination that you have to sort of do. Part of it, you got to be okay with that. You got to be okay with like, there's just like, vast gulfs of unknowable information, but it doesn't mean you can't jump across or, try and take a swim in it.
It seems like it's both mystery and it's translating physical topography, if that makes any sense whatsoever. I'm not sure if it does.
Yeah, I mean, it does. One of the people I quote a lot, and maybe we can mispronounce his name together, Goethe, Goethe.
Yes. I say Goethe, but I don't know if that's right. I have no idea, Thomas. I'm going to defer to you.
Oh, it's fine. Well, I mean, like, up until like, I was like, I don't know, 38, I was like, Goethe. Anyway, yeah, he has this, of course, he's, amazing. But he had this quote that I like to talk about. Any object well considered opens within us a new organ of perception. It's so good. Inkblots, and ink, those are the well-considered objects that I use to open up these organs of perception within me. I mean, to me, that is sort of like a divination. Like, if you just take something and meditate on it long enough, you start seeing how it connects, not just how it connects, but how there are parallels of the object in like different places. And like you start seeing like the world in this new way of like, this sort of like multidimensional, kaleidoscopic even, like, you're dilating your sphere of perception and reality to this point where you can like start making these like sort of like vast connections, and you can see them. You can understand the universe. You can just take a little bit of what you've learned in that big, crazy, vast, psychedelic world, and then like bring it back, that little connection that you see, and like between something this common as ink and the universe.
I know there are organizations that you've worked with in the past. I saw on your Instagram that transmute, firearms into shovels, for example, that are used to plant trees and beautiful things like that. But I really would love to talk about your collaborations too. Of course, you've collaborated with so many amazing artists, including Coleman Stevenson. Can you share about a recent collaboration that you did with Coleman and your Inkmobile? And please share with listeners what the Inkmobile is.
Yes, the Inkmobile. So I'm actually broadcasting from it right now. The Inkmobile, which, for now, it's still a working title. I don't know what it's really called. There's been a few names that have been bouncing around. But it's a large passenger cargo van, 1995 Dodge, rusty blue with an extended top and some really fun AirStats hardwood flooring and a little bed and a desk and a battery bank. It's a little mobile home on wheels, but also sort of a place I can operate out of and I make ink out of, and have been even sort of explaining my process out of the back of it, which was really fun. I recently visited Coleman, and her neighbors were very fun and receptive to coming and seeing my making of ink. It's neat. It's an experiment. So I had a studio for like about 3 years. And I sort of just got, tired of paying rent, honestly. It was a nice studio. I was like, I really just want to travel. And I also felt like the studio was always keeping me from going anywhere because, like, I could either spend money on traveling or I could pay rent. So I was like, well, I want to do both. I want to, have something that I could travel and do stuff with. So the van sort of became the idea. A very generous person, here's the money, go and do it. I love what you're doing. It's amazing. I'm like, wow, okay, cool, thanks. And it happened. So I'm driving around. I actually had slime mold growing in a little Tupperware container with me. So I was like, I really need the bumper sticker that says like slime is my co-pilot. I want to put it on the back. And we drove around. I've spread some of the amoeba throughout the Northeast. It's sort of like because I like Johnny Appleseed or Johnny slime mold, spreading it around. It's a fun little project. Actually, I brought some slime mold to Coleman's, and we did this really fun, we called it the ectoplasmic oracle. Because technically slime mold is ectoplasm, but just in the biological definition of like, that's the external plasm of the organism. There's endoplasm and ectoplasm. So I just call it ectoplasm because, why not? It is. It's true. Where else are you going to find some creepy slime thing that seems to exhibit intelligent behavior? I mean, like, that sounds like ectoplasm to me in both senses of the word. We created this little bell jar with the slime growing in a crystal goblet. Surrounding it, we had several tarot cards, and we sort of had it like ooze down. We were going to like figure out where the pseudopods, as they landed, what column they were going to hit, and interpret it that way. And that was a really fun thing. We had the neighborhood over for my little talk. And they were like, is that like, what sort of dessert is that under that bell jar? Like, no, it's not a dessert. If you did it on a flat thing of oatmeal, it would look a lot like lemon squares. So it's like it can be a dangerous thing to bring around, especially if there's like other covered dishes in the area.
That, Thomas, leads to the listener question for you from Coleman Stevenson, who is saying, quote, Thomas has a genius art mind like no one I've ever known. Question, Thomas, how is taking your Inkmobile on the road this autumn impacting the way you make art and develop new ideas / make new mental connections?
Well, of course, there's the scale thing. So when you're in a band, you can't exactly do a 5x6 painting or anything. Not that I really did make very big work before, but now my work is considerably smaller. And I like that, actually. I've always sort of been attracted to small worlds. I love I think it goes back a little bit to back when I was an animator too, like making little tiny miniatures and making little things. And it's sort of going along with how I work. But it also has me thinking a lot about how it's going to get somewhere. So if I'm going to make something fancy or fragile, I don't have a lot of room in the van to carry shipping material and padding and all that. So one of the things I've been thinking about as far as art goes is like making something and having part of the process actually be moving through the postal system. Like just mail the art, like, put a stamp on right on the where you drew, like, or fold it up funny, like make it its own envelope, have like the final process of the art be going through the mail system and making it to someone's door. Embracing like this idea of like, the mobility of not just me, but like, the art, like have the bruises and bumps from the road on it. That's one thing I was thinking about when I'm making art and making connections with folks. It's really kind of amazing the world you move through when you're in a van and you're sleeping in your van and you're doing odd things. Like I did a workshop at the Rochester Institute of Technology which was really cool. But, I was sleeping in a Cracker Barrel parking lot the night before. Like, I was talking to people who were, oh, that's a nice van. I have a van like that. That's a really neat van. I think what you're doing is amazing. And then like next thing you know, I'm like, I have to dress up for like academia and like have my like, little collar and sweater on and talk like I'm actually an expert at something. So it's been fun. It's like, you're intersecting through all these different pieces of life. That's always, very stimulating. And like, honestly, I'm still digesting it. I think it's going to take a while to like process all that I have, like, taken from the road with me. Oh, and the other thing is the work that I do. So, I can't carry a lot of guns around with me in the van if I want to be safe. I had the opportunity to pick up a whole lot of guns from a single collector right before I left. And I was like, oh yeah, that's going to be great. I can get this assault rifle, like this 9mm, this shotgun, this rifle, all these things that I could use and make ink out of. And then, a friend of mine was like, you're driving around in this really sketchy, rusty van with a lot of firearms and some chemicals that, are used in production of meth. Are you sure this is all a good idea? And you're crossing state lines. And I was like, you got a point. You got a really good point. So I was like, I'll just carry a little demonstrative gun with me that's like, partially dissolved. It's clearly not going to harm anyone. And I'll just, instruct rather than be like, a mobile, I don't know. I feel like a warmonger, an arms dealer of some sort. There's just no way for me to explain reasonably to the authorities that all my guns I'm going to turn these into ink, I promise.
Who are some of the other artists, other people, other organizations that you work with? I know we can talk a little bit about Tim McLaughlin as well. Can you just share with us who are some of the people who you work with or who have had a really big influence on you that you'd like to let listeners know about?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's like so many. The pigment community that is sort of developed has been, it's been incredible seeing all of these different folks from completely different disciplines, different perspectives coming together. Tim, who recently passed, he was the man behind Artesian Ink, who was one of my early friends through social media, who we talked about ink making, very skilled and talented photographer. Just want to say I'm thinking about him and his family. Heidi Gustafsson, who I mentioned earlier as well, she's an incredible, has a most amazing and thorough appreciation of the materials that she, has surrounded herself with. There's Tilka Elkins from the Wild Pigment Project, who also is involved with Lead to Life, that you mentioned earlier, who makes the guns into shovels. Tilka operated the Wild Pigment Project and the Ground Bright, which is sort of changing right now, but it was a sort of a subscription-based pigment program that a portion of the proceeds also went to support charitable work that included land stewardship, racial justice, social equality, and things along those lines. Tell someone like you make pigments, they're like, oh, whatever, that's so boring. Or like, it's like, whatever. It's like, you're making a color. Like they don't understand sometimes why we're doing what we're doing. Like, I guess they think we're all like, I don't know, in lab coats, like, making something for a large corporation. But like what we're doing is like, we're just understanding like the power of materially informed art supplies or like, mark making things. Jason Logan from the Toronto Ink Company, who makes ink from everything. I was in the documentary that was The Color of Ink that he was central to. And that movie also has lots of other amazing pigment people in it. There's a lot of wonderful folks out there and all coming together to illuminate the material quality of our symbol making stuff.
there's such depth to what you do. What would you like to leave listeners with in terms of either the process of making ink, the process of working with these truly older than dirt, almost biologically immortal beings, collaborating with artists? What would you like to leave listeners with in terms of just everything that you work with on a day-to-day basis?
I would like to leave someone with a engaged curiosity. I want people to understand all the joy and excitement that I've derived from things as simple as slimy mold and ink. Like, that's really not very humble materials. Like, but there's whole vast and amazing worlds within something as simple as that. And it goes back to what Goethe was saying. Any object well considered opens within you a new organ of perception. Like, I really feel like sometimes, I think that people would benefit if they could find a little spot to focus on that then they can dial back out of and appreciate the world within that context. And I also want people to know that don't be afraid of experimenting. Don't be afraid of getting sciencey with something. Don't be scared of sulfuric acid. Disclaimer, do not try this at home. I want people to engage with stuff. I want people to engage more. I feel like there's a lot of fear of not doing something right or messing up. I'm I really want people to enjoy an experiment, just thrill in the failure, even just enjoy it all. That's what I would like for people to take away, because if a fool persists in his folly, he shall become wise. So
listeners, there are definitely different ways to support Thomas, and I definitely want to ask you about some of those ways, but let me just throw one out there. In the course of this conversation, Thomas, I have become one of your patrons on patreon.com/aruralpen. There is an awesome membership that you have. So I would really encourage listeners, please, if you really appreciate and support Thomas's work of not only turning guns into ink, but working with these, various patterns and slime amoeba and lovely projects and the Inkmobile and all of these wonderful things, support Thomas on Patreon. So we'll make sure to link to that below. How else can people support you? And I'm sure there might be some listeners going, oh my gosh, does Thomas take commissions? And how can I support? Or where can I get Thomas's ink or anything like that? Please let us know.
So I only have one little presence, and that's on Instagram. And I am a rural pen, a.rural.pen. And one of the pin posts will have a list of stores that carry my ink. And that's mostly within the States. I might be expanding out beyond. There's 2 places in Canada. But if you're nearby and you want some of my ink, please go there and buy some. That would be great, because then I can sell them more ink and then I can keep making more ink. That would be a great way to support me. Follow me on Instagram, and every now and then, if I'm hard up for cash, I'll make some artwork. And, you can buy it.
Touche. I think we will all keep our ear to the ground. Actually, the best question, Thomas, just to end with is, you're clearly always thinking about something. You've been traveling to different states with the Inkmobile. Is there anything from an artist perspective that you just wake up in the morning and as you work, it's just infusing your consciousness?
Oh my gosh, there's too much, simply too much. There's projects that reboil up and surface again. I'm still working on making a printing ink formula that I think would be really good to spread around. I'm always obsessed with papercraft, origami. I want to make a toy theater. There's too much stuff. I need to rein it in. So actually what I need to do is wax corks to put on ink bottles, because I need to get ready for another shipment.
Artist, polymath, student of alchemy, ink historian, Thomas Little. Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your wisdom and your craft and your artistry on the podcast today. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed that podcast as much as I did. Thomas Little is amazing. Just hearing about his process of turning guns into ink, working with slime amoeba, and just connecting us to millions of years of working directly with nature. It's certainly an inspiration, and I hope that Thomas has inspired you as well to take your own artistic adventures. Definitely check out the links in the podcast and video description below to support Thomas on Patreon, as well as checking out his Instagram for the latest ink and other art updates. A huge thanks again to Thomas for his time and generosity, and also a huge thanks as always to each and every supporter of the Glitch Bottle podcast on patreon.com/glitchbottle. So if you would like to become a supporter with exclusive perks, check out patreon.com/glitchbottle. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.